All right, diving right in today. We're looking at something really interesting, something really important. It's about accelerating the transition from coal to renewables in Indonesia to achieve a net zero energy system.
That title's a mouthful, but it's a pretty crucial question, right? Especially with all the research that's been coming out, and some of it, honestly, pretty optimistic.
Oh, absolutely. Indonesia. I mean, you're talking about a major player in Southeast Asia growing like crazy.
Mm.
But here's the thing. They're hooked on fossil fuels. I mean, really hooked, especially coal.
And when you think about it, that dependency, that's what's pumping out those greenhouse gases. Their emissions have practically doubled in the last 20 years, something like a 122% jump. That's a lot.
Yeah, and think about what that means for a country like Indonesia. You've got this massive archipelago, tons of islands, people living all along the coast. They're staring down the barrel of climate change, literally. Rising sea levels, those crazy typhoons. It's not a joke. Not at all. They're really on the front lines, and they know it. I mean, Indonesia's got these targets, right? They want to peak emissions by 2030, hit net zero by 2060. Sounds good, but
But, and there's always a but. The IPCC, all those science folks, they're saying, hang on, that might not cut it. If you want to keep things below that 1.5 degrees C danger zone, they've got to move faster.
so this is where we come in. This deep dive, we're digging into how Indonesia can shift gears, ditch the coal, and go full-on renewable, get to that net zero, but faster. We've got this research, some pretty compelling stuff comparing all these different paths they could take, what's possible with the tech we have, and of course the money part, because that's always a biggie.
And this is what blew me away. The researchers, they went headfirst into this big question. What happens if Indonesia keeps throwing money at coal?
No.
Compared to, really going all in on a renewable future, a net zero future. And here's the shocker, that net zero path. It might not just be the good guy move, it might actually save them a boatload of cash. Seriously, that's a twist. And how's that even work? What makes this net zero thing not just possible, but, cheaper?
Well, there are a few big things. Solar. Solar's just getting cheaper, way cheaper, and it's reliable. Then you got batteries, got to be able to store that energy.
Mm.
And Indonesia, being all islands and such, they really got to beef up that power grid, connect everything.
Mm.
And then there are these cool cutting-edge technologies, power to X and things like that, add in some flexibility.
Right, got to keep the lights on no matter what. And I know they're big on biofuels, right? Palm oil, all that.
Huge. And the research actually digs into that, how that land use for biofuels stacks up against making cleaner fuels from solar. Some interesting comparisons there, for sure.
Okay, before we get ahead of ourselves, let's back up a bit. What does Indonesia's energy scene look like right now? So, snapshot from 2020. Fossil fuels, they were king, like 85.6% of the energy mix. And get this, between 2009 and 2020, the amount of coal they were using, that jumped big time, from 21% to 37%. Oil, on the other hand, went down a bit. Renewables, still pretty small back then, like 14.4%, mostly hydropower and biomass.
But where's all this energy going? It's transportation and industry that suck up the most, right?
Spot on. In 2020, transport and industry, each of them took a big bite, 39% of the total energy pie. Whatever was left, about 21%, that went to buildings, keeping the lights on and heating, all that. And of course, you've got your oil for transport, biofuels in the mix there, coal and biomass for industry. And for the folks at home, businesses too, it's mainly electricity.
Okay, so electricity. Coal's still the big kahuna, though, right?
No doubt about it. End of 2020, they had about 73 gigawatts of power capacity total, and over half, 50.4% to be exact, that was coal-fired plants. Natural gas and oil, they were in there too, but
Yeah.
coal was dominant. And here's the kicker. They've still got, get this, 33 gigawatts of coal power in the works, like under construction. That's a lot of new coal coming online, and that's why their emissions are still going up, up, up.
So it's like they're caught, right? Those new plants, that's a ton of money already sunk in.
Yeah, the average age of their coal fleet's only like 13 years. Problem is, a lot of those plants are, well, let's call them old school. They're not very efficient, not squeezing all the juice out of that coal. And pollution, forget about it, especially in places like Jakarta, tons of people, tons of pollution, big health costs. The research actually points this out, that sticking with coal, even giving it subsidies, it's like they're locking in high electricity prices and making people sick. It's a double whammy.
But wait, doesn't Indonesia have, like, crazy good potential for renewables? I mean, they've got sun, they've got wind.
Oh, totally. I mean, yeah, renewables were only about 15% of the installed capacity back in 2020, but the potential, it's massive. Solar, just solar alone could be cranking out something like 3,000 gigawatts. And then you've got bioenergy, hydropower, even wind, not as much as solar, but still significant. So the ingredients are there. And the best part, renewables are getting cheaper, more competitive with fossil fuels every day.
Okay, let's talk biofuels for a sec. Indonesia is a major player in the biodiesel game, and there's this big push for more,
Yeah.
especially using palm oil. What's the environmental downside?
Yeah, that's the elephant in the room, right?
Yeah.
They're the world's top producer and consumer of biodiesel, and the government loves palm oil. They really push it. Problem is, to grow all that palm oil, you need land, a lot of it. So what happens? Deforestation, big time. You lose all kinds of amazing species, biodiversity takes a hit, and then there's the fire risk, draining those peatlands, droughts, local communities getting squeezed out. It's a mess. Even the EU, they're starting to back away from palm oil biofuels because of all this.
But even with all that, the demand for biofuels in Indonesia, it's still supposed to keep going up, right?
Yeah, some projections say that by 2050, the demand will be huge, which means more pressure on land, more pressure on water resources. But here's the thing. The study highlights that Indonesia, with all that renewable potential, they could be making electricity-based fuels instead, e-fuels. Way less water, way less land.
Okay, so lots to unpack here. We've got Indonesia, energy demands rising, hooked on coal, some environmental red flags, but a ton of renewable potential. This research lays out a few different paths they could take. What are they and what makes them different?
Right, they've got three scenarios. The current policy scenario, we can call that CPS. Then there's the delayed policy scenario, DPS, and the one we're really interested in, the best policy scenario, BPS. So CPS, that's basically, keep on keeping on, no big changes, no real targets for cutting emissions, still burning a lot of fossil fuels. The DPS, that's kind of middle of the road. They try to use less coal, but it's slow going. And yeah, they built some new coal plants, not as many as in the CPS, but still.
Okay, and BPS. That's where things get interesting.
That's the all-in scenario. They're aiming for zero emissions, completely phasing out fossil fuels in the energy sector, all by 2050. Basically, they're taking the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees C target super seriously. No more new coal or fossil fuel plants, period. Anything in the pipeline gets scrapped. That's a big change right there.
A real turning point. So how does all this affect Indonesia's overall energy needs going forward? I mean, their economy's growing, more people, more demand, right?
Yeah, in all three scenarios, they see energy demand going way up by 2050. But here's the interesting part. The scenarios with more renewables, especially the BPS and DPS, they get a lot more efficient. Why? Because they're switching things over to electricity, transportation, heating, all that. So even though their economy's booming, their total energy use is actually lower than in the CPS, where they're still burning all those inefficient fossil fuels. The BPS, which goes 100% renewable, that one has slightly higher energy demand in 2050 compared to the DPS. That's because of the energy needed to make e-fuels, for stuff that's hard to electrify directly.
Makes sense. And how does this all play out in terms of where the energy's coming from?
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. In the BPS and the DPS, both of those, solar just takes over. After the 2030s, boom, it's the dominant source of electricity. By 2050, it's meeting almost all the demand, and coal's basically gone. Bye-bye, expensive, polluting coal. Now, in the CPS, well, coal's still hanging around, still about 50% of the electricity in 2050, with solar playing a much smaller role. But in the renewable heavy scenarios, you've got hydropower, geothermal, they're pitching into providing that baseload power.
So a big shift in how they're making electricity. How does that ripple out to other things like heating homes and all the cars and trucks on the roads?
Right, so heating. Pretty much everyone agrees that fossil fuels are out, electric heating and heat pumps are in, across all three scenarios by 2050. Makes sense. Now, for industrial processes, those really hot ones where it's hard to use electricity directly, e-fuels, especially in the BPS and DPS, they become essential. For transportation, the BPS goes big on electric vehicles, obviously, but they also use e-fuels like e-hydrogen and e-methane for things like planes and ships, plus some truly sustainable biofuels. The DPS, they're electrifying too, but still relying more on biofuels and some fossil fuels. And the CPS, well, they stick with what they know. Fossil fuels for transportation, with a sprinkle of biofuels.
Well, that's solar and wind. It's not always sunny. It's not always windy. That's where energy storage and a strong grid come in, right?
Totally. The study's really clear about that. The BPS, being the most renewable heavy, needs the most storage, followed by the DPS. So batteries for electricity, hydrogen storage for industry, and making those e-fuels, even heat storage. It all becomes super important. And to make it all work, they need to upgrade that grid, connect those islands, make sure that renewable energy can flow freely, especially in the BPS, where they're moving a lot of electricity between islands. Connections like East Java, Bali to Nusa Tenggara, Sumatra to West Java, those become super important.
Just how much do they need to beef up that grid capacity?
Okay, so in the renewable heavy scenarios, by 2050, we're talking big increases. is. The BPS needs the most, 158 gigawatts. DPS, a bit less, 107 gigawatts. But the CPS, because they're sticking with those centralized fossil fuel plants, they only need a small bump, 22 gigawatts. The Sumatra-Java connection, that one gets the biggest upgrade in both the BPS and DPS. Got to move all that renewable power around.
Let's jump back to the biofuel thing for a minute. The research had some interesting numbers on land use. What were the key takeaways there?
This is where Indonesia needs to pay attention. Making e-fuels from solar, it uses way less land than growing palm oil for biofuels. Like, way less. We're talking 19 times more energy per square kilometer from solar e-fuels compared to palm biodiesel. And direct electricity from solar, that's even better, 37 times more efficient.
Wow, that's a huge difference. And that's about more than just using land efficiently, right?
Oh, yeah. You've got food production, deforestation, biodiversity, water resources, all that gets tangled up in this land use question. Even in the BPS, where biofuels play a small role, the land they need still increases by 2030. And that's a decent chunk of Indonesia's land. And when you compare how much land it takes to fuel a car, biofuels are just way less efficient. Electric cars powered by solar, or even regular cars using solar e-fuels, they use so much less.
So it seems like focusing on solar, both for electricity and for making e-fuels, that could be a way smarter move for Indonesia, both for the environment and for making the most of their land.
Exactly. That's the message from the research. They can ditch the fossil fuels without trashing the environment, which is a big concern with those palm oil plantations.
Okay, so different paths, different energy sources, the importance of storage and the grid, the whole land use thing. Now, the big question, how much is all this going to cost?
All right, here's where the BPS, that ambitious net zero plan, really shines. The researchers found that going renewable, even quickly, could save Indonesia a ton of money, like 42% less in annual energy costs by 2050 compared to sticking with coal, and the total cost over time. Way lower in both the BPS and the DPS compared to the CPS.
Hold on, going green and saving money, how does that work?
Well, mainly it's the money they don't have to spend on fuel and dealing with emissions. Yes, there's a big upfront cost for all those solar panels and wind turbines and upgrading the grid, all that. But once it's built, solar and wind are super cheap to run. No more buying expensive fossil fuels and no worries about carbon taxes down the road. The research actually shows that the average cost of electricity in 2050 is way lower in the BPS and the DPS compared to the CPS.
Makes sense. And what about emissions? How do those shake out in the different scenarios?
The BPS, they hit zero CO2 emissions from the energy sector by 2050, right on track for that 1.5 degrees C goal. The DPS, their emissions peak around 2025 and then slowly go down, but they don't hit net zero because they're still using some fossil fuels. And the CPS, well, their emissions just keep climbing because they're still burning all that coal. But the BPS, that shows what's possible. Indonesia can get to carbon neutrality in its energy sector for real, using solar, hydropower, and geothermal.
So to wrap it all up, this deep dive into the research shows that Indonesia has a real opportunity here. Ditching coal and going renewable, hitting net zero by 2050, it's not just the right thing to do for the planet. It might actually be the smarter economic move. And they could save a lot of money doing it.
Yeah, it's kind of a no-brainer. The best path, both for the economy and the environment, it's all about solar. Tons of solar, backed up by batteries and a much stronger grid to connect those islands. And we know Indonesia has what it takes. That potential for solar is gigantic, something like 3,000 gigawatts.
Right, that grid is key. Got to be able to share that renewable energy between the islands, especially those key connections we talked about. East Java Bali to Nusa Tenggara, Sumatra to West Java. They need to invest big time.
And don't forget about biofuels. Indonesia loves its palm oil, but the research is pretty clear.
Wow.
Solar e-fuels, way more bang for your buck, way less land needed, and no rainforest destruction.
They also can't forget about storage, especially batteries. Good thing they have all that nickel. And hydrogen storage, that's going to be important too.
One last thought, and this is a big one. All those coal plants they're building. What happens to those if the world moves to renewables? They become stranded assets, useless, a waste of money. The study says that by 2045, if Indonesia goes net zero, those stranded coal assets could be worth a fortune, a lost fortune.
So Indonesia's at a crossroads. Huge renewable potential, a chance to save money and lead the way. But there are challenges. What are the biggest ones? Policy, building all that new infrastructure, getting everyone on board. And how can the rest of the world help? These are the questions we need to be asking. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.